In the remote hollows of 1840s Appalachia, where fog clings to mountains like secrets and civilization feels like a distant myth, 12-year-old Elisabeth Hartley discovers that her father has made arrangements with mysterious men who arrive each autumn. What begins as whispered conversations behind closed doors transforms into a horrifying revelation about a network of families selling their daughters to unknown buyers. As Elisabeth uncovers the truth about where these girls actually go, she realizes the nightmare isn't just about being sold, it's about what the buyers are preparing these children for, and why some girls who escape can never truly speak of what they witnessed. The story twists through layers of deception, ancient pacts, and a conspiracy that has roots deeper than anyone in these mountains dares to imagine. The autumn of 1840 brought more than cold winds to the Hartley cabin. It brought the men in black coats, and with them the kind of silence that makes even the crickets stop singing. Elisabeth Hartley pressed her ear against the rough wooden planks, separating her small sleeping area from the main room, her breath forming tiny clouds in the frigid air. She was 12 years old, though her father often forgot this detail, sometimes calling her 10, sometimes 14, as if her age were as changeable as the weather. Her mother had died 3 winters past, leaving Elisabeth to care for her 2 younger brothers, James, who was 9, and Thomas, who was 7. The boys slept soundly on their shared straw mattress, oblivious to the voices filtering through the cabin walls. But Elisabeth had learned to stay awake on nights when strangers visited. She's of prime age now. "Hartley," a voice said, smooth as river stones and twice as cold. "We've been patient, haven't we? Watching her grow, waiting for the right time." The agreement was clear. Elisabeth's father, William Hartley, coughed, that wet, rattling sound that had been getting worse since summer. "I know what was said, Mr. Thorne. I know what I promised. But she's useful here. The boys need tending and winter's coming hard." There was a pause, filled only by the crackling of the fire, and Elisabeth imagined she could hear coins clinking, metal against metal, a sound that seemed to echo in her chest. "The agreement wasn't a suggestion," another voice interjected, this one rougher, like gravel scraped across wood. "You took the money 5 years ago. You knew what it meant. October moon's waxing full in 3 days. We'll return then." Elisabeth's heart hammered so violently she feared they might hear it through the wall. What agreement? What money? She knew her father was a hard man, weathered by loss and the brutal isolation of mountain life. But this conversation suggested something far worse than mere hardness. The strangers left shortly after him, their horses' hooves crunching through the frost-hardened ground. Fading into the darkness beyond the tree line, Elisabeth waited, counting her breaths, before slipping back onto her own thin mattress. Sleep wouldn't come. Instead, her mind raced through memories she'd never properly examined before. The way her father sometimes looked at her, with something like sorrow mixed with resignation. The time last spring, when a different set of strangers had visited, and her father had sent her to fetch water from the creek, a task that took hours, and when she returned, he'd had enough money to buy flour and salt pork for a month. The neighbor girl, Mary Sutton, who disappeared 2 autumns back, everyone said she'd run off to Louisville. But Mary had once told Elisabeth she'd never leave her little sisters behind. Morning came grey and reluctant. Elisabeth fed the boys cornmeal mush while her father sat at the table, not meeting her eyes. His hands shook slightly as he ate, and she noticed the leather pouch on the table's edge, fuller than it had been in months. "Papa," she said carefully, "who were those men?" His spoon clattered into his bowl. "No concern of yours. Eat your breakfast." But James, always too curious for his own good, piped up. "I heard voices last night. Sounded like city folk." Their father's hand shot out faster than Elisabeth would have thought possible, catching James across the cheek hard enough to knock the boy sideways off the bench. "You'll learn to sleep when you're told, and keep your mouth shut about things you don't understand." Elisabeth gathered James into her arms while Thomas began to cry softly. This wasn't their father's usual harshness. This was fear, and that terrified her more than anger ever could. That afternoon, While her father checked his traplines, Elisabeth did something she'd never dared before. She searched the cabin. In the hollow beneath a loose floorboard, under their father's bed, she found a wooden box she'd seen once or twice, but never thought to open. Inside lay documents written in a hand far finer than anyone in these mountains could produce. The language was formal, almost legal, filled with terms she didn't fully understand. But certain phrases leaped out at her with horrible clarity. Female child, delivered upon reaching 12 years of age. Payment rendered in advance. Suitable for training purposes. Final collection October 1840. Transfer of ownership complete upon delivery to designated representatives of the society. Her hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped the papers. There were more documents beneath. Certificates, she realized, each bearing a different girl's name. Mary Sutton, Hannah Creek, Patience Wild. Girls she'd known or known of, all vanished over the past 5 years. All listed with dates, ages, and beside each name, a sum of money that made Elisabeth's stomach turn. Her father had sold her. Not to slavery in the traditional sense. This was something else. Something the documents called the Appalachian Collection Initiative and referenced preparation facilities in the eastern settlements. She heard his footsteps on the porch and barely managed to replace everything before he entered. 3 rabbits slung over his shoulder. He looked at her strangely. "You're pale. You sickening?" Elisabeth shook her head, not trusting her voice. That night after her brothers slept, she lay awake planning. 3 days until the full moon. 3 days to figure out what these men wanted, where they took the girls, and how to escape a fate her father had sold her into before she'd lost her first tooth. The cabin creaked in the wind, and somewhere distant, she heard what might have been an owl, or might have been something else entirely. A sound almost like a girl screaming, cut short. The mountains held secrets in their hollows. She'd always known that. But now she understood that some secrets had teeth, and they were coming for her. The next morning brought a visitor Elisabeth hadn't expected, old Granny Ashwood, the herb woman who lived 3 ridges over. The ancient woman appeared at dawn, her presence announced by the jangling of the bone chimes she wore around her waist. Elisabeth's father seemed unsurprised, almost as if he'd been expecting her. "She knows, doesn't she?" Granny Ashwood's voice crackled like dry leaves. "I can see it in her eyes. You waited too long to keep her ignorant, William Hartley." Elisabeth's father said nothing, just stared into his coffee. The old woman turned her rheumy eyes on Elisabeth. "Come with me, child. We need to talk about what's coming, and your fool father won't tell you the truth of it." They walked into the woods, Elisabeth casting nervous glances back at the cabin. Granny Ashwood moved with surprising speed for someone who claimed to be 93 years old. When they were far enough that the cabin disappeared behind the trees, the old woman stopped and fixed Elisabeth with a stare that seemed to pierce right through her skull. "The men who came for you aren't traders in the way you might think," Granny Ashwood began, settling onto a fallen log. "They don't sell girls to brothels or factories. What they do is older and stranger than that. There's families in these mountains been making agreements with them for generations. Trading daughters for money, for favor, for things I won't speak of. The girls go east, to a place they call Thornhill Manor. And there," she paused, her wrinkled face twisting with something between disgust and fear. "There they're prepared," Elisabeth found her voice. "Prepared for what?" The old woman pulled a small cloth bundle from her bag and unwrapped it carefully, revealing what looked like a dried flower, black as coal. "You ever wonder why some winters are harder than others? Why some years the game runs plentiful and others you can't find a squirrel? Why some families prosper while others starve? There's a balance in these mountains, child. A payment that's required. The Society of the Eastern Gate, that's what those men serve. They've been collecting girls for near about 100 years now, maybe longer. They say it started with a pact made by the first settlers, desperate people who'd do anything to survive these harsh lands." Elisabeth's mind reeled. "But what happens to the girls? Where do they go after this manor?" Granny Ashwood's expression turned grim. "That's the question, isn't it? Some say they're married off to wealthy men in distant cities. Others whisper darker purposes, rituals, sacrifices, things that'd make your blood freeze. But here's what I know for certain. I've been alive a long time, and I've seen 37 girls collected from families within 20 miles of here. Not one has ever been seen or heard from again. Not one letter, not one visit, not even a grave to mark their passing. They vanish as completely as morning mist. The weight of this settled over Elisabeth like a burial shroud. Then I have to run. I'll take my brothers and You'll do no such thing, the old woman interrupted sharply. They'll hunt you. They have dogs trained to track through any terrain. Men who know these mountains better than you ever will. And if you run, they'll take one of your brothers instead. Or they'll burn your father's cabin with him inside. Or worse, they'll mark your whole family as oathbreakers. And you don't want to know what happens then. Elisabeth felt tears burning in her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Then what do I do? Just let them take me? Granny Ashwood leaned forward, her breath smelling of mint and something medicinal. You do something no other girl has done. You go willingly, but you go prepared. You watch, you learn, and you find out what they're really doing with these children. And when you know the truth, if you survive long enough to learn it, you find a way to send word. Because this evil has been festering in these mountains too long, and someone needs to cut it out at the root. She pressed the black flower into Elisabeth's palm. Keep this hidden on your person. If you're ever in mortal danger, chew it and swallow. It'll give you one chance, one only, to do something they won't expect. What that something is, you'll know when the time comes. The old woman stood, bones creaking audibly. I can't stop what's coming for you, child, but I can give you a fighting chance to maybe, just maybe, end this curse before it claims another generation. They walked back in silence, and when the cabin came into view, Granny Ashwood simply melted back into the forest without another word, leaving Elisabeth alone with knowledge that felt heavier than stones. That night, lying between her sleeping brothers, Elisabeth made her decision. She would let the men take her, not out of submission, but as an act of defiance. She would become what no collected girl had been before, a witness who survived to tell the tale. The black flower rested against her heart, sewn into a small pocket she'd made in her shift. Outside, the moon grew fuller, and somewhere in the darkness, she imagined she could hear the sound of horses approaching, still days away, but coming inevitably, like death itself. Her father's cough echoed from the next room, and she wondered if guilt kept him awake, or if he slept soundly on his blood money. 3 days remained. 3 days to prepare for a journey into darkness that would either kill her or transform her into something these mountains had never seen before. A girl who refused to be forgotten. The second day before the collection passed in a strange, suspended terror that made every ordinary task feel like a last ritual. Elisabeth woke before dawn and went about her chores with mechanical precision, milking the goat, drawing water from the creek, stirring the porridge that her brothers ate without knowing these might be the last meals she'd prepare for them. Her father avoided her eyes entirely now, spending most of the day in the woods, supposedly checking traps, but really, she suspected, hiding from his own conscience. Thomas noticed something was wrong. He was sensitive that way, always had been, and clung to her skirts more than usual, his small hand constantly reaching for hers. James, still nursing a bruised cheek from their father's strike, watched her with questions in his eyes that she couldn't answer. Around midday, Elisabeth made a decision that would have seemed reckless if she'd had anything left to lose. She needed to know more about where she was going. And there was only one other person in these mountains who might tell her, Silas Creek, Anna Creek's father, the man who'd traded his daughter 2 years prior. The Creek cabin sat in a hollow so deep the sun barely reached it even at noon, a place that always smelled of dampness and rot. Elisabeth told her brothers she was going to gather herbs and set off through the forest, following the deer paths she'd known since childhood. The walk took nearly 2 hours, and with each step, she rehearsed what she'd say, how she'd convince a man to speak about something he'd probably spent 2 years trying to forget. She found Silas Creek sitting on his porch, whittling a piece of wood into nothing in particular, his hands moving with the automatic motion of someone who needed to keep busy or go mad. He looked up as she approached, and she saw the recognition in his eyes turn immediately to something like pain. "You're Hartley's girl," he said, "not a question. Elisabeth, isn't it? You've got the look about you now. Same look Hannah had right before." He didn't finish the sentence, just returned to his whittling with increased vigor, the knife biting into the wood with small, violent cuts. Elisabeth stepped onto the porch uninvited. "They're coming for me in 2 days. My father made the agreement, took the money. I found the papers." Silas laughed, a sound without humor. "Of course you did. They always find out eventually. Hannah found my papers too, came to me crying, begging me to stop it. I told her what my father told me when I was young enough to still have a conscience, that the agreement is binding, that breaking it brings worse things than losing one daughter." He looked up at her then, really looked, and she saw his eyes were red-rimmed. Whether from drink or tears she couldn't tell. "You want to know what I know about where they take you? About Thornhill Manor and the society?" Elisabeth nodded, not trusting her voice. Silas set down his whittling and gestured for her to sit. "I'll tell you what I learned, though it won't comfort you none. Anna's been gone 26 months now. Not a word, not a sign, just like Granny Ashwood probably told you. But 6 months back I got desperate. Started asking questions in places I shouldn't, talking to people who deal in information. Cost me near everything I had left, but I found someone who'd been to Thornhill Manor, a man who'd done carpentry work there some years ago. He pulled out a pipe and tobacco, his hands shaking as he packed it. The manor sits about 200 miles east, in the Virginia Piedmont, on an estate so large it takes half a day to ride across. High walls surround it, guards patrol the perimeter, and the main house itself is built like a fortress. The carpenter said he only worked on the outer buildings, never was allowed inside the main structure. But he saw things that bothered him enough he left before finishing the job and never went back. Elisabeth leaned forward. What did he see? Silas lit his pipe, the smoke curling between them like a ghost. Girls, dozens of them, maybe more, all between 12 and 15 years old, all dressed identical in grey dresses, all moving in complete silence. He said they walked in lines, always supervised, never speaking, never looking at anyone directly. He watched them during his lunch breaks, tried to wave at one once, friendly-like, and a guard struck him across the back with a rod and told him if he acknowledged the girls again, he'd lose the hand he waved with. That's when he started paying closer attention to things. The carpenter had noticed other details, strange schedules where the girls would be led into the main manor at odd hours and not emerge for days. Deliveries that came in covered wagons, always at night, always guarded by armed men. And sounds, particularly on nights when the moon was full, sounds that he described as singing, but not like any hymn or song he'd ever heard. Voices rising in unison in a language he didn't recognize. A sound that made his teeth ache and his dreams turn dark. "He told me one more thing," Silas continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Said there was a graveyard on the property, but not a normal one. No names on the stones, just numbers." He counted 47 markers, all identical, all recent enough that the stone hadn't weathered yet. When he asked about it, he was told those were previous servants who died of natural causes, but he didn't believe it. 47 dead servants in just a few years, in a place that size. The numbers didn't make sense. Elisabeth felt the black flower pressing against her chest. Granny Ashwood's mysterious gift, suddenly feeling less like protection and more like confirmation that she'd need a way to die quickly if things went truly wrong. "Did your source say anything about what they're training the girls for? What the purpose is?" Silas shook his head slowly. "That's the question that's been eating at me every night since Hannah left." The carpenter didn't know, but he did say something odd. Said the girls he saw all had this look in their eyes, like they were there but not there, present but absent. He used the word hollow to describe them. Said it was like looking at beautiful dolls that someone had forgotten to put souls into. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of these revelations settling between them. Finally, Elisabeth asked the question she'd been dreading. "Do you regret it? Trading Hannah?" Silas's face crumpled, aging 20 years in an instant. "Every second of every day. But here's the evil of it. The thing that keeps me from putting a bullet in my own head. The money they paid me kept my other 3 children alive through last winter. The medicine I could buy saved my youngest boy from the fever that took 4 children in the valley. The food I could purchase kept them from starving. So did I trade one daughter's life for 3 other children's survival? That's what I tell myself. That's the lie I have to believe, or I'll go mad." He grabbed Elisabeth's arms suddenly with surprising strength. "But you listen to me, girl. If you get any chance, any opportunity at all, you run. You fight. You do whatever you have to do to get away from those people. Because I see Hannah in my dreams sometimes, and she's not dead. That would almost be better. She's something worse than dead. Something I don't have words for." Elisabeth left the creek cabin, with more questions than answers, but with something else too, confirmation that her instinct to go as a conscious witness, rather than an ignorant victim, was the right choice. She had to know what happened at Thornhill Manor, had to understand what this society was really doing with these girls. The walk home took longer because she kept stopping, memorizing details of the forest, the shape of particular trees, the sound of specific creeks. She didn't know if she'd ever see these mountains again, and the thought of forgetting them was almost as painful as the thought of what lay ahead. When she reached the cabin, she found her father had returned and was sitting at the table with a jug of whiskey, already half drunk, though the sun hadn't yet set. He looked up at her with eyes that were simultaneously defiant and defeated. "You went to see Silas Creek?" It wasn't a question. "I know, because you've got that same look Hannah had, like you're already planning how to survive something that can't be survived." Elisabeth set down the basket she'd carried as a pretense for her journey, empty of the herbs she'd supposedly gone to gather. "Tell me the truth, Papa. Tell me why you did this. Not the easy answer about needing money, the real reason. Because I know you got paid 5 years ago, and we've been just as poor as ever." "So where did the money go?" Her father took a long drink straight from the jug before answering. "Your mother. The money went to your mother." Elisabeth felt the floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "Mama died 3 years ago. You got paid 5 years ago. That doesn't— The money paid for 2 extra years," her father interrupted, his words slurring slightly. 2 years of medicine, of treatments from a real doctor in the settlement, of care that gave her 2 more years with us than she would have had otherwise. She had the wasting sickness, the kind that takes you quick and painful, but the treatments slowed it down, made it bearable. She got to see Thomas grow from a toddler to a boy. She got to teach you how to cook her special recipes. She got 2 more Christmases. The revelation hit Elisabeth like a physical blow. Her father had traded her future for her mother's past, had sold her before she was even old enough to understand what was being taken from her. "Did Mama know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her father's silence was answer enough. After a long moment he spoke again. "She knew. Near the end, when the pain got real bad and the medicine stopped working, she begged me to break the contract, said no extra time was worth what it would cost you. But by then it was too late. The agreement is binding. They explained that very clearly when I signed. If I try to back out now, they don't just take you, they take all of you. You, James, Thomas, me. The whole family pays the price for oath-breaking." He looked at her with something that might have been pleading. "I thought I was choosing between losing your mother right then, or losing you years later, when you'd be old enough to have had some life first. I didn't know. I didn't understand what I was really agreeing to." Elisabeth felt a strange calm settle over her, the kind of clarity that comes when you stop fighting against the inevitable and start planning how to survive it. "Tell me exactly what the men said when you made the agreement. Every word you can remember." Her father seemed surprised by the request, but began to speak, his whiskey-loosened tongue recalling details he'd probably tried to forget. The agreement had been proposed by Mr. Thorne, the smooth-voiced man who'd visited 3 nights ago. He'd appeared at their cabin 5 years prior, somehow knowing that William Hartley had a daughter of 7 and a wife dying of wasting sickness. He'd offered a sum of money that seemed impossible, enough to pay for years of medical treatment, in exchange for one simple thing. When the daughter reached her 12th year, she would be collected and taken to Thornhill Manor for training and placement in a position suited to her capacities. The language had been formal, almost legal, but vague enough that William had convinced himself it meant his daughter would be placed as a servant in a wealthy household, a position that might actually give her better prospects than a life of poverty in these mountains. He made me sign papers, her father continued, documents that had seals and ribbons like government forms. Said the Society of the Eastern Gate had been helping mountain families for generations, that it was a charitable organization dedicated to providing opportunities for children who'd otherwise have none. He showed me testimonials from other fathers, letters praising the program, talking about how their daughters had gone on to marry well or find good positions. I wanted to believe it. God help me. I wanted to believe it so badly that I didn't ask the questions I should have asked. Elisabeth felt a cold anger crystallizing in her chest. You believed what you wanted to believe because it made the choice easier. You traded me for Mama's comfort and told yourself it was a kindness. Her father flinched as if she'd struck him. What would you have had me do? Watch your mother die in agony months earlier? Hear her screaming in pain every night? I made a choice, and maybe it was the wrong one, but it was made out of love, not cruelty. The worst part, Elisabeth realized, was that she could understand it. If faced with the same impossible choice, save someone she loved now or protect someone else's future, what would she have chosen? The thought made her sick because she couldn't be certain she'd have chosen differently. That night, she lay awake listening to her brothers breathe, memorizing the sound, wondering if she'd ever hear it again. Tomorrow was the last full day. Tomorrow night, the moon would be nearly full, and the morning after, the men would come. She touched the black flower hidden against her heart and made a silent promise to herself, to her mother's memory. To all the forgotten daughters of Appalachia, she would not go quietly into whatever darkness waited at Thornhill Manor. She would learn their secrets, understand their purposes, and if she couldn't escape, she'd at least leave a trail for someone else to follow. The mountains had taught her to be strong, to survive, to endure. Now she'd need every lesson they'd ever given her, because she was about to enter a place where survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant keeping your soul intact in the face of whatever horrors waited in the society's carefully guarded halls. The final day arrived, with a dawn so red it looked like the sky was bleeding. Elisabeth woke to find her father already gone, his bedroll cold, and realized he'd left before sunrise to avoid facing her on this last morning. Coward, she thought, though the word carried less venom than it should have. She understood cowardice now in a way she hadn't before, understood how fear could hollow out a person's courage and leave only the shell of justifications behind. She dressed carefully in her best dress, the grey homespun one her mother had made 3 years ago, the stitching still tight and even. If she was going to be taken, she'd go looking like she had some dignity left, not like a wild mountain child who didn't know better. Her brothers woke and seemed to sense something terrible in the air because they were quieter than usual. Even James, who normally chattered like a jaybird from the moment his eyes opened, she made them a proper breakfast, using the last of the precious white flour to make biscuits, frying salt pork until it was crispy, even opening the jar of honey they'd been saving. Thomas watched her with wide eyes. "Why are we having feast food?" he asked, honey dripping down his chin. Elisabeth smiled, though it felt like her face might crack from the effort. "Because today's special. I want you both to remember today." James, older and more perceptive, set down his biscuit half-eaten. "You're leaving, aren't you? That's what those men came about. They're taking you away. There was no point in lying. Yes, I have to go with them. Papa made an agreement before you were born, and now it's time for me to honor it." Thomas began to cry, immediately big tears rolling down his round cheeks. "But you can't go. Who'll take care of us? Who'll tell us stories at night? Who'll—" His words dissolved into sobs, and Elisabeth gathered him into her lap, breathing in the smell of him, little boy sweat and wood smoke and honey. James didn't cry. Instead, he looked at her with an expression far too adult for his 9 years. "Is it like what happened to Hannah Creek? Are you going to disappear and never come back?" Elisabeth met his eyes steadily. "I don't know what's going to happen, but I want you to listen to me very carefully, both of you." She waited until even Thomas had quieted enough to hear. "No matter what Papa tells you about where I've gone or what I'm doing, I want you to remember this. I didn't want to leave you. If I never send a letter, if you never hear from me again, it's not because I forgot you or stopped loving you. Do you understand?" They nodded, though Thomas's lower lip still trembled. "And one more thing. If you ever hear stories about girls being collected, about families making agreements with men in black coats, you tell everyone who'll listen that it's wrong. You tell them about me, about Hannah, about all of us. You make sure we're not forgotten. Can you promise me that?" James nodded solemnly. "I promise. I'll tell everyone. I'll make them remember." Elisabeth pulled them both close, memorizing the weight of them, the warmth. The way Thomas's hair stuck up in a cowlick no amount of water could tame. The way James's shoulder blades felt sharp and fragile under her hands. This, she thought, this is what I'm really losing. Not my future as some abstract concept, but these specific moments, these particular people, this exact configuration of love that would never exist again. Around mid-morning, she heard voices outside and knew without looking that the men had arrived early. Her father had returned too. She could hear his distinctive cough, along with several other voices she didn't recognize. Taking a deep breath, she smoothed her dress, checked that the black flower was still safely hidden in its pocket, and walked to the door. She would face this standing upright, with her head high, because she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cower. Outside, 3 horses stood in the clearing, and beside them, 4 men. Mr. Thorne she recognized from his voice, a tall man with silver hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the complete lack of warmth in his eyes. The gravel-voiced man was shorter, broader, with hands that looked like they could snap a sapling in half. The other 2 were younger, perhaps in their 20s, dressed in the same black coats, but with an air of subordinates rather than leaders. All 4 turned to look at her as she emerged, and she saw Mr. Thorne's lips curve into something approximating a smile. "Miss Elisabeth Hartley, how prompt! We do appreciate punctuality." His voice was exactly as she remembered, smooth and cold. "Are you prepared for your journey?" Elisabeth's father stood off to the side, looking at the ground, his hands clenched into fists. She ignored him completely and addressed Mr. Thorne directly. "I'm as prepared as anyone can be for being sold like livestock. Shall we dispense with the pleasantries?" The gravel-voiced man laughed, a harsh bark of sound. "Got spirit, this one. That'll either serve her well or get broken out of her quick." Mr. Thorne shot him a quelling look. "Miss Hartley, I understand this seems frightening, but I assure you the Society of the Eastern Gate has only your best interests at heart. You're being given an opportunity that most girls in your circumstances could never dream of. Education, refinement, placement in a position of significance. You should be grateful." Elisabeth felt rage boiling in her chest, but forced herself to speak calmly. "Grateful for being taken from my family without my consent, based on an agreement I never made, to a place I've never heard of, for purposes no one will explain clearly. Yes, I'm overflowing with gratitude." Mr. Thorne's expression hardened. "Your father explained the terms. You're old enough to understand that sometimes families must make difficult choices for the greater good." "Whose greater good?" Elisabeth shot back. "Because it certainly isn't mine, and it isn't my brothers who are losing their only remaining caretaker." One of the younger men shifted uncomfortably, and Elisabeth caught his eye. He looked away quickly, but not before she saw something there, discomfort, maybe even shame. That was interesting. Not all of them were completely heartless, which meant not all of them were completely committed to whatever this enterprise was. She filed that information away for later. Mr. Thorne pulled out a pocket watch and checked it with deliberate slowness. We have a schedule to maintain. Miss Hartley, you'll ride with Thomas, he indicated the gravel-voiced man, on his horse. The journey to Thornhill Manor will take approximately 5 days. You'll be provided with food and basic necessities. Any attempt to escape will be dealt with harshly, not just for you, but for your family here. Do you understand? Elisabeth nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She turned back to the cabin where her brothers stood in the doorway. James with his arm around Thomas's shoulders, both of them looking small and lost. She walked back to them, knelt down, and pulled them into a final embrace. Be brave, she whispered to James. Take care of Thomas. Don't let Papa drink himself to death, and don't you dare forget about me. To Thomas, she said, remember the stories I told you. About the girl who turned into a bird and flew away? That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to find my wings somehow. She stood, kissed each of their heads, and walked back to the waiting men without looking back again, because if she did, her courage would shatter completely. The gravel-voiced man, Thomas, she noted with bitter irony, sharing a name with her youngest brother, hauled her up onto his horse with about as much gentleness as someone loading a sack of grain. She settled in front of him, trying to maintain as much distance as possible, which was difficult given the saddle's configuration. The horse shifted beneath them, and she grabbed the pommel to keep from sliding. Comfortable? Thomas asked, his breath reeking of tobacco and something worse. Thrilled, Elisabeth replied flatly. Mr. Thorne mounted his own horse with considerably more grace, and the small procession began to move. Elisabeth kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at her father, refusing to acknowledge his existence. As they rode past the creek cabin, she saw Silas standing on his porch, watching. Their eyes met for just a moment, and she saw a flash of something in his expression, sorrow, guilt, and maybe just a hint of hope that she might succeed where Hannah had failed. Then they were past, moving into the forest, following a trail Elisabeth had never taken, heading east toward the settled lands, and whatever horrors waited at Thornhill Manor. The morning wore on, and they rode in silence, except for the sounds of horses and harness, birds calling, wind in the trees. Elisabeth kept her mind occupied by observing everything. The trail markers, distinctive rock formations, the position of the sun. If she ever got a chance to escape, she'd need to know how to get home. Around midday, they stopped at a creek to water the horses. Elisabeth was allowed down, her legs cramping from the unfamiliar position, and she walked a short distance away, ostensibly for privacy, but really to test how closely they'd watch her. Thomas followed at a discreet distance, hand on the pistol at his belt. No chance of running then, not yet. The younger men, she heard them called Samuel and Robert, spoke in low voices, while Mr. Thorne studied a map. She edged closer, straining to hear. Seems too aware, Samuel was saying. Most of them are crying by this point, or silent with shock. This one's watching everything like she's planning something. Robert shrugged. Thorne says the smart ones are actually preferable. They adapt better to the training, retain the lessons more effectively. But what if she's too smart? Samuel persisted. What if she figures out? She won't figure out anything until it's far too late, Thomas interrupted, having apparently finished his surveillance of Elisabeth. They never do. By the time they understand what's really happening, they've already been changed too much to do anything about it. Elisabeth turned away, pulse racing, and pretended to splash water on her face while her mind worked furiously. Changed too much to do anything about it. What did that mean? Some kind of physical transformation? Mental conditioning? Something else entirely? She thought of the carpenter's description of the hollow-eyed girls walking in perfect silence, present but not present, and felt ice forming in her stomach. They resumed riding in the afternoon, and as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Mr. Thorne led them off the main trail to a small clearing where they'd apparently camped before. There were stones arranged in a fire pit, logs positioned for sitting. We'll stop here for the night, Mr. Thorne announced. Samuel, Robert, tend the horses. Thomas, secure the perimeter. Miss Hartley, you'll sleep over there. He pointed to a spot near a large oak tree, where we can keep an eye on you. Don't bother trying to slip away in the night. We sleep in shifts, and the forest is full of dangers for a girl alone." They ate a cold supper of hard bread and dried meat, no one speaking much. Elisabeth noticed that they didn't tie her up, which suggested either supreme confidence in their ability to catch her if she ran, or knowledge of some other constraint she hadn't yet discovered. As darkness fell and the fire burned down to coals, she lay on the blanket they'd given her and stared up through the oak branches at the stars. The black flower pressed against her chest, a small, hard lump that was both comforting and terrifying. Granny Ashwood had said it would give her one chance to do something unexpected. But what and when? She couldn't waste it, couldn't use it too early before she'd learned what she needed to know. Somewhere in the darkness an owl called, and Elisabeth thought of her brothers, probably crying themselves to sleep in the cabin that would feel too empty now. She thought of her father, drowning his guilt in whiskey. She thought of Hannah Creek and all the other forgotten daughters, and she made a vow to the stars overhead that she would not be forgotten, would not become one of the hollow-eyed girls who disappeared without a trace. The days that followed developed a rhythm that was almost hypnotic in its monotony. Wake before dawn, ride all day with minimal stops, camp at night in predetermined locations, sleep fitfully while one of the men kept watch. Elisabeth tried to engage her captors in conversation, hoping to learn more about what awaited her, but they'd clearly been instructed to reveal nothing. Samuel was the most likely to respond to her questions, but even he would only offer vague reassurances that she'd understand everything once they reached the manor. On the third day, they left the mountain trails behind and entered more settled territory. Actual roads now, with occasional farmhouses visible in the distance. Elisabeth noticed Mr. Thorne became more talkative as they travelled through inhabited areas, actually speaking to her in tones that someone overhearing might interpret as friendly, even paternal. It was a performance, she realized. A show, in case anyone happened to observe them and wonder about a young girl travelling with 4 adult men. "You'll find Thornhill Manor quite impressive," Mr. Thorne said as they passed through a small town, his voice pitched to carry to the shopkeeper standing in a doorway. The grounds alone span several hundred acres, and the educational facilities are truly first-rate. "Many distinguished young ladies have trained there." The shopkeeper nodded politely, apparently seeing nothing suspicious about the scene. Elisabeth considered screaming, claiming she was being kidnapped, but remembered the threat to her family and kept silent. Besides, who would believe her over these well-dressed, respectable-looking men? A mountain girl with no evidence, no proof, nothing but a wild story about being sold. She'd be dismissed as hysterical or worse, and then the consequences would fall on James and Thomas. On the 4th night, they camped in a proper inn, and Elisabeth slept in an actual bed for the first time in her life, though she was locked in a room with Mr. Thorne, sleeping across the doorway, making escape impossible. The next morning, the final day of their journey, Mr. Thorne came to her room with a bundle of clothes. "Put these on. From this point forward, you must look the part of a young lady entering an educational institution, not a wild mountain child." The dress he'd brought was finer than anything Elisabeth had ever seen. Dark blue wool with proper buttons, a white collar, even a ribbon for her hair. She dressed reluctantly, feeling like she was putting on a costume for a play she didn't want to perform in. When she emerged, Mr. Thorne actually smiled, the expression somehow more frightening than his usual cold neutrality. "Much better. Remember, Elisabeth, your demeanor from this point forward will determine not just your own experience at Thornhill Manor, but potentially your family's well-being. Cooperation is in everyone's best interest." It was a threat delivered in the language of advice, and Elisabeth understood it perfectly. They rode through increasingly cultivated countryside, passing plantations and estates that spoke of wealth Elisabeth could barely comprehend. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith, they crested a hill, and Mr. Thorne reined in his horse. "There," he said, pointing ahead, "Thornhill Manor." Elisabeth looked and felt her breath catch. The estate sprawled across the valley below, like a small kingdom unto itself. High stone walls enclosed the property, topped with what looked like iron spikes. Beyond the walls, she could see formal gardens, outbuildings, and at the center, the manor house itself, a massive structure of grey stone, 3 stories tall with wings extending in both directions, windows that caught the sunlight and reflected it back like watching eyes. It looked less like a school and more like a prison, and Elisabeth felt the last of her naive hopes die. This was no charitable institution. This was something else entirely. Something dark and purposeful, and she was about to enter its gates with no idea if she'd ever emerge again. The black flower seemed to burn against her chest as they rode down toward the valley, toward the high walls and watching windows, toward whatever secrets Thornhill Manor had been keeping for 100 years. Elisabeth straightened her spine and lifted her chin. She would enter as a prisoner, but she would leave as a witness, or she would die trying. The gates of Thornhill Manor opened with a sound like a death rattle, iron scraping against stone, and Elisabeth felt every instinct in her body screaming to run, even though there was nowhere to go. The walls rose 15 feet high on either side, smooth stone offering no handholds, no possibility of climbing. 2 guards stood at attention as they passed through, both carrying rifles, both watching her with expressions of complete indifference. As if girls being delivered to this place was so common, it didn't warrant even a flicker of interest. The path beyond the gate wound through meticulously maintained gardens that would have been beautiful if they hadn't felt so profoundly wrong. Every hedge was trimmed to geometric perfection, every flower bed arranged in patterns so precise they looked artificial. And nowhere, Elisabeth realized with growing unease, was there any sign of the girls the carpenter had described seeing. The gardens were utterly empty of human life except for their small procession. They rounded a final curve, and the manor house loomed before them, even more imposing up close than it had appeared from the hilltop. The architecture was elegant but austere, with none of the decorative flourishes she'd seen on other grand houses during their journey. It looked functional, purposeful, designed not to impress but to contain. Mr. Thorne dismounted and gestured for Elisabeth to do the same. Her legs felt weak as she slid down from the horse, 5 days of riding having left her muscles sore and unaccustomed to supporting her own weight. She stumbled slightly, and one of the younger men, Samuel, reached out to steady her, his hand gentle on her elbow. "Careful," he murmured, and she caught his eye again, seeing that same flicker of discomfort she'd noticed before. He looked away quickly, releasing her arm as if it had burned him. The main doors opened before they reached them, and a woman emerged, who made Elisabeth's blood run cold despite the warmth of the afternoon sun. She was perhaps 50 years old, dressed entirely in black, with silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. But it was her eyes that truly frightened Elisabeth, pale grey eyes that assessed her with the clinical detachment of someone evaluating livestock. "Mr. Thorne," the woman said, her voice crisp and precise, "you've brought the Hartley girl. Right on schedule, as always." She turned those terrible eyes on Elisabeth. "I am Madame Cécile Mordaunt, headmistress of Thornhill Manor. You will address me as Madame Mordaunt at all times. You will speak only when spoken to. You will obey every instruction immediately and without question. Do you understand?" Elisabeth met her gaze steadily, refusing to look away first. "I understand that you expect obedience. Whether you receive it is another matter." The silence that followed her words was absolute, and Elisabeth saw Mr. Thorne's expression darken with anger, while Thomas actually laughed. Madame Mordaunt's face remained completely impassive, but something flickered in those pale eyes, surprise perhaps, or possibly interest. Spirited. That's useful in its own way, though you'll learn to channel it more appropriately. "Bring her inside." She turned and walked back through the doors without waiting to see if her command would be followed. Mr. Thorne grabbed Elisabeth's arm hard enough to bruise. "You will not embarrass the society with displays of defiance. One more outburst like that and the consequences will fall. On those brothers you seem to care so much about. Am I clear?" Elisabeth nodded stiffly, and he released her, gesturing for her to follow Madame Mordaunt. The interior of Thornhill Manor was as austere as its exterior, all dark wood and stone, with minimal decoration. The entrance hall was vast and cold, their footsteps echoing on marble floors. Madame Mordaunt led them down a corridor lined with closed doors, each identical to the last. Numbered in brass plaques, but offering no other identification, they reached a room at the end of the hall, and Madame Mordaunt opened the door to reveal what appeared to be an office, furnished with a heavy desk, several chairs, and walls lined with filing cabinets. She gestured for Elisabeth to sit in the chair facing the desk while she settled behind it, pulling out a ledger and opening it to a marked page. Mr. Thorne remained standing by the door, arms crossed. Elisabeth Marie Hartley, Madame Mordaunt read from the ledger. Born March 1828, making you 12 years and 7 months old. Mother deceased, father living, 2 younger brothers. Contracted to the society in 1835 for a term of... She paused, looking up. Well, that depends entirely on your aptitude and cooperation. Some girls complete their training in as little as 3 years. Others require considerably longer. Elisabeth's stomach dropped. 3 years minimum. She'd be 15 before she could even hope to leave this place, assuming she survived whatever training they had planned. What exactly is this training? Elisabeth asked, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. What are you preparing us for? Madame Mordaunt smiled, a thin expression that never reached her eyes. All in good time. First, you'll undergo an evaluation period of 2 weeks, during which we'll assess your capabilities, your temperament, and your suitability for various tracks of development. Based on those assessments, you'll be assigned to one of 3 programs. She ticked them off on her fingers. The first is domestic placement, for girls who show aptitude for household management and service. These girls are eventually placed with wealthy families as highly trained servants. The second is educational development, for girls who demonstrate intellectual capacity. These girls may become governesses or teachers. The third, she paused, and Elisabeth saw something predatory flash across her face. The third is special placement, reserved for girls with particular qualities we find valuable. And which placement did Hannah Creek receive? Elisabeth asked, watching Madame Mordaunt's reaction carefully. The headmistress's expression didn't change, but her fingers stopped moving on the ledger page. Hannah Creek, yes, she was here. She completed the 3rd track and was placed approximately 18 months ago. Quite successfully, I might add. The casual mention of Hannah as if she were just another name in a ledger made Elisabeth's rage flare hot and bright. Where was she placed? Can I write to her? Madame Mordaunt closed the ledger with a soft thump. Communication with former students is not permitted. It would only distract from your training and give you false impressions of what your own experience might be. Each girl's path is unique, which was, Elisabeth understood, a polite way of saying she'd never hear from or about Hannah again. Mr. Thorne spoke from his position by the door. The girl has been briefed on expectations. She understands the consequences of non-cooperation. I trust she'll be a model student. Madame Mordaunt stood, and Elisabeth realized the interview was over. We'll see. Mr. Thorne, your payment will be processed through the usual channels. Thank you for another successful collection. She rang a small bell on her desk, and within moments a girl appeared in the doorway, the first student Elisabeth had seen. She was perhaps 14, wearing a grey dress identical to what the carpenter had described, her dark hair pulled back severely, her face utterly blank of expression. She didn't look at Elisabeth, didn't look at anyone, just stood with her hands folded and waited. This is subject 49, Madame Mordaunt said, and Elisabeth's blood ran cold at the word subject rather than student or girl. She will escort you to the preparation room, where you'll be processed. Follow her instructions exactly. The girl, subject 49, turned and walked out without speaking, and Elisabeth had no choice but to follow, very aware that Mr. Thorne remained behind, presumably collecting his payment for delivering her. The corridor they walked down was identical to the one they'd left. More numbered doors, more echoing silence. Elisabeth tried to engage the girl. What's your real name? Where are you from? Subject 49 didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that Elisabeth had spoken. They descended a staircase into what must have been the basement level, the air growing cooler, the walls changing from finished wood to bare stone. Finally, they reached a door marked simply processing, and the girl opened it, gesturing for Elisabeth to enter. The room beyond was tiled floor to ceiling in white, bright and clinical, containing a metal tub, a table with various instruments that made Elisabeth think of a hospital or possibly a butcher shop, and another woman in a white apron who looked up as they entered. "New arrival?" the woman asked, not really waiting for an answer. "Strip down completely. Leave your clothes in the basket. You'll be issued proper attire after cleansing." Elisabeth's hands went instinctively to the hidden pocket containing the black flower. She couldn't let them find it, couldn't let them take away her only potential weapon. "Could I have some privacy?" she asked, trying to sound meek rather than defiant. The woman in the white apron laughed. "Privacy is a luxury you've left behind. Strip now, or I'll have the guards do it for you." Subject 49 stood by the door, still expressionless, still silent, and Elisabeth realized with sick certainty that this was what they did to the girls. Stripped away everything, privacy and dignity and individuality, until they became blank subjects in grey dresses. She turned her back, fumbling with the buttons of the dress Mr. Thorne had given her, her mind racing. When she got to her shift, the one containing the hidden pocket, she palmed the black flower as she pulled the garment over her head, then pretended to stumble, catching herself against the wall and in that moment slipping the flower into her mouth, tucking it between her cheek and gum. The woman approached, running impersonal hands over Elisabeth's body, checking for hidden items, pausing at the slight bulge in her cheek. "Open your mouth." Elisabeth's heart hammered, but she complied, using her tongue to push the flower to the roof of her mouth, where it might be less visible. The woman peered in, seemed satisfied, and stepped back. Into the tub. The water was ice-cold, and the scrubbing that followed was rough enough to leave her skin red and raw. They washed her hair with something that stung her scalp, then rinsed her with buckets of equally frigid water. When she emerged, shivering violently, they toweled her dry with brutal efficiency and handed her undergarments and a grey dress identical to the one Subject 49 wore. "These are your standard garments. You'll receive 2 additional sets. They are to be kept clean and mended at all times. Buttons," she pointed to the plain wooden buttons, "are not to be removed or altered. Length must remain exactly as issued." Elisabeth dressed quickly, the fabric rough against her sensitized skin, and carefully transferred the black flower from her mouth to a new hiding place, working it into the hem of her dress while pretending to adjust the fit. It was risky, but she had no better option. When she was fully dressed, the woman pulled out a leather collar, perhaps 2 inches wide, with a metal plate attached. "Hold still." Elisabeth jerked back. "What is that?" The woman's expression suggested this was a tedious question she'd answered many times. "It's your identification collar. The number corresponds to your processing order. You're Subject 63. The collar remains on at all times except during bathing, which is supervised. Removal without permission results in severe punishment." Elisabeth felt panic rising. "I have a name. I'm Elisabeth Hartley, not a number." The woman's expression didn't change. "You were Elisabeth Hartley. Now you're Subject 63. The sooner you accept this, the easier your transition will be." Subject 49 stepped forward and took the collar from the woman, approaching Elisabeth with those same dead eyes. Up close, Elisabeth could see that she was younger than she'd first appeared, maybe only 13, and there was something wrong with the way she moved. A mechanical quality that suggested either extensive training or something more sinister. The girl fastened the collar around Elisabeth's neck with practiced efficiency, the leather fitting snugly but not quite tight enough to restrict breathing. The metal plate was cold against her throat. "There," the woman in the white apron said with satisfaction. "Properly. Processed. Subject 49, take her to orientation." They climbed back up the stairs, Elisabeth's hand going repeatedly to the collar, feeling the weight of it, the constraint. It felt like a symbol, of everything this place intended to do to her, strip away her identity, reduce her to a number, make her interchangeable with all the other forgotten daughters. But they hadn't found the black flower. She still had that, still had one secret they didn't know about, one small piece of resistance they hadn't managed to take. Subject 49 led her through more corridors, up another flight of stairs, until they reached a large room that might once have been a ballroom. Now it was filled with rows of simple wooden desks, and at each desk sat a girl in a grey dress, wearing a collar identical to Elisabeth's. There must have been 40 girls in the room, ranging in age from what looked like 12 to perhaps 16, and every single one of them sat in perfect silence, hands folded, eyes forward. A woman stood at the front of the room, older than Madame Mordaunt, with a face like carved granite. She gestured to an empty desk in the third row. Subject 63, take your seat. You're joining orientation in progress. Pay attention. Elisabeth sat, her mind reeling from the sight of so many girls, so many forgotten daughters, all reduced to numbers and silence. Subject 49 took a seat 2 rows ahead, and Elisabeth noticed for the first time that the numbers on the collars weren't sequential. The girl next to her was Subject 57. The one in front was Subject 42. The woman at the front resumed speaking in a monotone that suggested she'd given this lecture countless times. The Society of the Eastern Gate was founded in 1741 by a group of enlightened individuals who recognized that the wilderness of this new land required sacrifices to be properly tamed. The original compact was made between the Society's founders and the forces that govern the deep places, the old places, the places where civilization's light has not yet penetrated. In exchange for prosperity, for protection, for the blessing of successful settlement, certain offerings were required. Elisabeth felt ice forming in her veins. Offerings. They were talking about the girls as offerings. The woman continued, her voice never rising or falling, just that same flat recitation. You have been selected by your families to fulfill this compact. You should feel honored to play such an important role in maintaining the balance between the civilized world and the wilderness that seeks always to reclaim it. Your training here will prepare you for your ultimate purpose, which will be revealed when you have proven your theory of understanding it. A girl 3 rows ahead, Subject 36, according to her collar, raised her hand slightly. The woman at the front nodded. Speak, Madame Instructor, the girl said, her voice trembling. What happens after the training? Where do we go? The preparation process. Do you understand? Elisabeth nodded, not trusting her voice. The doctor gestured to the chair. Sit. The restraints are necessary not for your safety but for ours. The evaluation process can trigger involuntary responses, and we've learned through unfortunate experience that unrestrained candidates can injure themselves or others. Elisabeth approached the platform, every instinct screaming to run, even though there was nowhere to go. The guards flanked her, ready to force compliance if necessary, but she climbed onto the platform and sat in the chair voluntarily. Resistance now would accomplish nothing. The restraints were applied with practiced efficiency, leather straps around her wrists and ankles, a band across her forehead holding her head immobile, all tight enough to prevent movement, but not quite tight enough to cut off circulation. Dr. Thaddeus moved to a table against the wall and began preparing something, mixing liquids from various bottles into a crystal glass. The first stage of evaluation involves what we call receptivity testing. I'm going to administer a compound that will lower your mental barriers and make you sensitive to presences you normally couldn't perceive. If you possess the inherited capabilities we suspect, you'll be able to sense and potentially communicate with entities from the other realm. If you lack such capabilities, you'll simply experience unpleasant hallucinations for several hours before recovering. He approached with the glass, which contained a liquid that seemed to shift colors as it moved, now deep purple, now sickly green, now a shade of red that reminded Elisabeth of fresh blood. Drink this. All of it? Elisabeth had no choice with her head restrained and the doctor holding the glass to her lips. The liquid tasted like rotting flowers and burnt metal, coating her throat with an oily residue that made her want to gag. She forced herself to swallow once, twice, 3 times until the glass was empty. Dr. Thaddeus stepped back, watching her with clinical interest. The effects will begin in approximately 3 minutes. Try to remain calm. Fear makes the experience significantly more traumatic. He moved to the edge of the circle and began to chant in that same language Elisabeth had heard in the night singing, his voice creating patterns that seemed to resonate with the metal inlays in the floor. The first sensation was heat, spreading from her stomach outward, making her skin feel like it was burning from the inside. Then her vision began to distort, the circular room seeming to expand and contract with her heartbeat, the shadows deepening and taking on substance. She heard whispers at the edge of perception, voices speaking words she almost understood, and the air itself seemed to thicken, becoming resistant to breathing. The restraint suddenly felt necessary because her body wanted to convulse, to flee, to do anything to escape what was happening. Then she felt it, a presence in the room that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had always been there, but she'd lacked the capacity to perceive it. Something vast and cold and utterly alien, paying attention to her with an intensity that made her feel like an insect under examination. The presence pushed against her mind, testing her boundaries, seeking entry points. And Elisabeth understood with horrible clarity that this was what the transformation would entail. Allowing that presence full access to her consciousness, letting it reshape and inhabit her. Every survival instinct she possessed screamed to resist, to throw up mental walls and refuse the intrusion. But she remembered Dr. Thaddeus saying that resistance made candidates unsuitable, and unsuitable candidates were discarded. If she wanted to survive long enough to find a way to destroy this place, she had to appear suitable, had to pass this evaluation. So instead of resisting, she did something that felt like opening a door in her mind, creating a small space where the presence could enter without overwhelming her completely. The result was agony beyond anything physical. The presence flooded into that space and immediately tried to expand, to consume more of her consciousness, and Elisabeth had to fight to maintain the boundaries while appearing receptive. It was like trying to hold back a flood with her bare hands while pretending she wasn't struggling. The entity, and she understood now it was a singular entity, not the collective force she'd imagined, seemed curious about her, probing her memories, examining her fears and desires and the grief she carried for her lost mother and separated brothers. She felt it particularly interested in the grief, feeding on that emotion in ways that made it grow stronger while leaving her feeling hollow. Then it spoke, not in words, but in concepts that translated themselves into understanding. It asked what she wanted most in the world, and Elisabeth, unable to lie with this thing inside her mind, thought of her brothers, of wanting them safe and cared for. The entity seemed pleased by this, offering what felt like a bargain, serve as its bridge willingly, and it would ensure her brothers prospered, that they never suffered want or danger. Elisabeth felt the terrible temptation of that offer, the desperate desire to accept any terms that would protect James and Thomas. But she also sensed the trap within it, understood that accepting would mean surrendering herself completely, becoming nothing but a vessel for this entity's will. She managed to think, though it cost her tremendously, that she wanted her brothers safe, but not at the cost of her soul. And the entity's response was something like laughter, dark and vast and infinitely patient, suggesting that souls were negotiable currencies, and she'd eventually offer hers gladly once she understood the alternatives. Then, mercifully, Dr. Thaddeus's chanting changed pitch, and the presence withdrew, sliding out of her mind and leaving a void that felt worse than its occupation. Elisabeth gasped, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking violently against the restraints. The doctor approached, checking her pulse, examining her, eyes nodding with satisfaction. "Excellent! Better than excellent, actually. You not only perceived the entity, but engaged in direct communication. Most candidates at this stage simply sense a vague presence and experience terror. You showed both receptivity and the capacity to maintain boundaries, exactly the combination we need. The entity itself expressed interest in you, which virtually guarantees successful transformation. He began unbuckling the restraints, and Elisabeth realized hours must have passed, though it had felt like both minutes and eternities. Her muscles cramped as she tried to move, and she would have fallen if the guards hadn't caught her. Dr. Thaddeus handed her a cup of water, which she drank greedily, trying to wash away the taste of the compound and the feeling of violation that came from having that presence inside her mind. You'll rest now for 3 days. The compound needs time to clear your system, and you need time to process the experience. Then we'll begin the preparation protocols in earnest. The transformation itself will occur in 13 days during the new moon. Between now and then, you'll undergo 6 more sessions of increasing intensity, each designed to expand your receptivity and familiarize you with the entity that will eventually integrate with your consciousness. You should feel honored, Subject 63. The entity that chose you is one of the senior members of the court. They rarely deign to work with new candidates. Elisabeth couldn't speak, could barely think, as she was half carried back to her room. They locked her in without food, apparently part of the recovery protocol, and she collapsed onto her bed. The next 3 days passed in a haze of nightmares and waking visions. The compound had triggered something in her perception that didn't fully close when the session ended. She saw shadows moving with purpose, heard whispers in empty rooms, felt presences watching from corners. Was this what her mother had experienced constantly? This awareness of things beyond normal perception? If so, no wonder she'd sometimes seemed distant, distracted, half present in the material world. On the 4th day, Elisabeth woke feeling more herself, though permanently changed in ways she couldn't articulate. A guard brought food and clean clothes, and she was informed that she could move freely within the manor's 3rd floor, but was forbidden from attempting to leave that level or communicate with other subjects. The isolation was deliberate, she understood, designed to make her increasingly dependent on the only human contact available, Dr. Thaddeus and his preparation sessions. She spent those days exploring the 3rd floor library when no one was watching, searching for information about the transformation process. Most of the books were philosophical treatises on the nature of sacrifice and transcendence, but she found one slim volume hidden behind others that appeared to be someone's personal journal. The entries were dated 1823 to 1825, written by someone identified only as Subject 17, and they detailed her own transformation preparation with heartbreaking honesty. Subject 17 had been 15 when collected, had possessed strong inherited sensitivities, had been selected for special placement within weeks of arrival. Her early entries were defiant, planning escape, documenting the society's crimes. But as the preparation sessions progressed, her tone changed. She began to see beauty in the entity working with her, began to believe the transformation was actually an honor, began to volunteer information about other resistant subjects to prove her worthiness. The final entries were ecstatic, describing her eagerness for the transformation ceremony, her certainty that she would emerge as something glorious and powerful. The journal ended there, but Elisabeth knew how the story finished. There was a grave marked 17 beyond the east wall. Whatever Subject 17 had believed, the transformation had killed her. Elisabeth read the journal 3 times, absorbing the warning it contained. The preparation sessions weren't just about increasing receptivity, they were about psychological conditioning, breaking down resistance, making candidates eager participants in their own destruction. She had to be aware of this, had to guard against it, had to maintain her sense of self, even as they tried to convince her that surrender was evolution. The black flower hidden in her hem felt like an anchor to her humanity, a reminder that she had one chance to do something unexpected. But what and when? The 6th preparation session was the worst yet. Dr. Thaddeus introduced her to 3 entities simultaneously, forcing her to manage multiple presences in her mind while maintaining consciousness. The experience was like drowning while on fire, while being torn apart, all happening in the space between her ears. She heard herself screaming, felt herself begging for it to stop, and hated her weakness even as she understood it was unavoidable. When it ended, she could barely remember who she was. Had to repeat her name, Elisabeth Hartley, not Subject 63, over and over, until it felt real again. The days blurred together, each preparation session leaving her more fragmented, more susceptible to the entity's influence. She noticed herself beginning to think of the transformation as inevitable, even desirable, and had to consciously fight against that acceptance. 3 days before the new moon ceremony, Dr. Thaddeus informed her that she'd passed all preliminary evaluations and was confirmed for transformation. "You should be proud," he said, and part of her, a part that horrified her, actually felt pleased by his approval. That night, alone in her room, Elisabeth forced herself to confront the truth. She was breaking. The preparation sessions were working. In 3 days, she would be taken to that circular chamber, strapped to whatever altar they used for transformations, and she would probably cooperate willingly because they'd conditioned her so thoroughly. Unless she used the black flower before then, before they could complete the conditioning process, she pulled it from its hiding place, studying it in the moonlight filtering through her barred window. It was withered now, more fragile than when Granny Ashwood had given it to her, but it still radiated something. Warmth, power, a sense of concentrated purpose. Elisabeth thought about the old woman's words. One chance to do something unexpected. She'd assumed that meant using it during the transformation itself, but perhaps she'd been wrong. Perhaps the unexpected thing was to use it now, before the final conditioning could break her completely, to do something that would disrupt the entire ceremony. But what would it do? Would it kill her? Grant her some kind of power? Simply make her sick? There was only one way to find out, and waiting meant risking that she'd become too conditioned to resist at all. Elisabeth made her decision. Tomorrow was the final preparation session before the transformation. She would take the flower then, during the session when the entities were already present in her mind, when Dr. Thaddeus would be focused on managing the ritual. Whatever happened, it would at least be her choice, her action, her one moment of defiance against everything they'd tried to do to her. She tucked the flower carefully into a pocket she'd sewn into her shift, right against her heart, where she could access it quickly. Then she lay down and tried to sleep, though her mind raced with fear and determination and a wild hope that Granny Ashwood's gift would prove to be exactly what she needed. The moon outside her window was a thin crescent now, waning toward darkness. In 3 days, it would be gone entirely, and in that absolute darkness, the Society of the Eastern Gate would attempt their transformation ceremony. But Elisabeth Hartley had other plans. She would swallow the black flower, embrace whatever power or poison it contained, and either die on her own terms or survive with something the society hadn't prepared for. The forgotten daughters would have their witness after all, even if that witness had to become something more than human to tell their tale. She closed her eyes and dreamed of her brothers, of the cabin in the mountains, of a world where girls weren't sold to feed ancient hungers. And in her dreams, the black flower bloomed into something that looked like hope, dark and strange, and utterly unexpected, just as Granny Ashwood had promised. The final preparation session began at midnight, when the manor was silent, except for the sounds Elisabeth had learned meant ceremony, distant chanting, the smell of burning herbs, footsteps moving in ritual patterns. She was brought to the circular chamber, wearing only a thin shift, her feet bare on cold stone, and she could feel the black flower pressing against her chest like a second heartbeat. Dr. Thaddeus waited with 5 others she'd never seen before, all robed, all wearing masks carved to resemble faces that weren't quite human. The chamber had been prepared differently this time. 7 candles instead of lamps, their flames burning in colors that shouldn't exist, and the metal inlays in the floor glowed faintly with their own light. Subject 63, Dr. Thaddeus said from behind his mask, his voice resonating strangely. Tonight, you will meet all 7 members of the court who will participate in your transformation. This final preparation ensures your consciousness can withstand their combined presence. Kneel in the center. Elisabeth walked to the platform, her hand slipping into her shift to touch the flower. Not yet. Wait for the right moment. She knelt as instructed, and the robed figures formed a circle around her, beginning to chant in that alien language that made reality feel thin and permeable. The first entity arrived like a wave of cold, flooding into her mind with familiar pressure. Then the second and third, each bringing different qualities: hunger, curiosity, something that might have been amusement if such concepts applied to beings so fundamentally other. By the fifth entity, Elisabeth's consciousness felt stretched to breaking, and she understood this was the point, the moment when candidates either surrendered completely or shattered. The robed figures chanted louder, their voices creating harmonics that seemed to open her mind further, making room for the final 2 entities. That's when Elisabeth reached into her shift, pulled out the black flower and swallowed it whole. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The flower dissolved on her tongue, releasing something that tasted like lightning and felt like fire racing through her veins. The entities in her mind recoiled as if burned, and Elisabeth felt the boundaries of her consciousness suddenly solidify, becoming impenetrable where they'd been permeable moments before. Dr. Thaddeus's chanting broke off. "What did you do? What did you take?" But Elisabeth couldn't answer, because something was happening inside her that defied description. The flower's essence was spreading through her body and mind, and where it touched, it left something changed. She could still feel the entities trying to press into her consciousness, but now they encountered barriers that burned them, that actively repelled their influence, and more than that, she could feel the flower opening pathways in her perception that the society's preparations had never accessed, showing her the true nature of what she was facing. The entities weren't the ancient powers the society believed them to be. They were parasites, feeding on human consciousness, sustained by the transformations that left girls as hollow bridges they could inhabit and control. The Court of Endless Hunger was accurate. They were endlessly hungry because they were fundamentally empty, existing only to consume. And the society's founders hadn't made a bargain with primordial forces governing the wilderness. They'd been duped by predators who'd promised prosperity in exchange for prey, who'd learned to speak the language of philosophy and sacrifice to make their feeding seem noble. Elisabeth saw all of this in a flash of terrible clarity, and she started to laugh. The sound echoed strangely in the circular chamber, and Dr. Thaddeus pulled off his mask, his amber eyes wide with something between fascination and fear. "She's still conscious. That shouldn't be possible with all 7 present. What did you give her?" He grabbed Elisabeth's shoulders, shaking her. "What was that flower?" Elisabeth met his eyes, and she could see her own eyes reflected there, changed, no longer quite human, but not hollow like the transformed girls either. Whatever the flower had done, it had made her into something the entities couldn't feed on, couldn't inhabit, couldn't consume. "A gift," she said, her voice resonating with harmonics similar to the chanting, "from someone who understood what you really are, not servants of ancient powers. Just parasites who learn to dress up feeding as transcendence." The entities in the chamber reacted to her words with something like rage, pressing harder against her mind, but the flower's protection held. Dr. Thaddeus stepped back, and Elisabeth saw genuine fear in his expression for the first time. "Guards, restrain her immediately. The transformation has failed. She needs to be terminated before—" But Elisabeth was already moving, the flower's essence giving her speed and strength she'd never possessed. She knocked aside the nearest robed figure, grabbed one of the strangely colored candles, and smashed it against the wall. The flame spread impossibly fast, racing along the curtains and wooden furniture as if it were oil instead of fabric and wood. The robed figures scattered, and in the chaos Elisabeth ran. She didn't know where she was going, just followed instinct and the flower's guidance. racing through corridors she'd never traversed, down staircases, towards something she could sense but not name. She found Catherine in the West Dormitory, asleep in a room with 3 other girls. Elisabeth shook her awake, ignoring the startled cries from the others. "We're leaving, now. There's a fire spreading. Use the chaos to escape." Catherine's eyes went wide, but she didn't hesitate, just grabbed Elisabeth's hand and ran. They burst into a corridor filling with smoke, girls emerging from rooms in confusion, guards shouting contradictory orders, and the smell of burning growing stronger. Elisabeth led them down, always down, following the flower's pull towards something important. They reached the East Wing basement, the forbidden section, and Elisabeth understood what the flower wanted her to find. The evidence, the truth, the bodies. She kicked open door after door, finding chambers set up like the one where her evaluation had occurred, finding restraint systems and altars and walls covered in those eye-watering symbols, and finding girls, 7 girls strapped to platforms, unconscious, prepared for tomorrow night's transformation ceremony. The renewal of the compact. "Help me free them," Elisabeth commanded, and Catherine immediately began unbuckling restraints, while Elisabeth moved to the last door, the one that radiated cold and wrongness even through the wood. She kicked it open and found what she'd somehow known would be there: the failed transformations. The girls who'd broken during the process but hadn't died, kept alive in some twilight state because the entities still fed on them. 23 girls in various states of consciousness, their eyes hollow, their bodies frail, kept in cages like animals. Elisabeth felt rage so pure it burned brighter than any fire. "We're getting you out," she said, though most couldn't hear her, couldn't respond. She found keys hanging on the wall and began opening cages while Catherine brought the unconscious girls from the other chambers. The smoke was thicker now, alarms ringing, and Elisabeth could hear guards approaching. They had minutes at best. She led her group, Catherine, 7 unconscious girls they carried between them, 23 broken girls who could barely walk, toward the service entrance she'd observed during the supply delivery. The guards reached them just as they made it outside, but the confusion of the fire worked in their favor. Elisabeth faced the guards, and something in her changed eyes, in the way she stood, made them hesitate. "Let us pass," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that made them flinch. "The Society of the Eastern Gate ends tonight. You can choose to die with it or live to answer for your crimes." Most of the guards ran. The few who didn't found themselves facing 31 girls who'd been transformed by rage and desperation into something fiercer than any society preparation could have created. They made it through the gates, which stood open as servants and staff fled the burning building. Elisabeth led her group into the forest, following paths she somehow knew, though she'd never walked them, the flower's essence still guiding her. They traveled through the night, a strange procession of girls in shifts and nightgowns, some conscious and helping, others barely aware, all of them moving away from Thornhill Manor as it burned behind them. By dawn, they'd covered 10 miles, and Elisabeth finally allowed them to rest in a clearing beside a creek. Catherine collapsed beside her, breathing hard. "What happened to you? Your eyes are different." "You're different." Elisabeth touched her face, feeling changes she couldn't see. "I'm still me, but I'm also something the society didn't plan for. The flower gave me immunity to those parasites they worship. I can see what they really are now, understand how they feed. And I know what we have to do." Over the next days, as they made their way north toward settlements where they might find help, Elisabeth told Catherine everything the flower had revealed. The entities weren't ancient powers, but opportunistic feeders who'd found humans particularly susceptible to their influence. The society's prosperity had never come from any compact. It had come from normal economic development that the founders attributed to supernatural bargains to justify their actions. The girls had been collected and transformed for nothing, their suffering feeding parasites while enriching men who'd convinced themselves exploitation was philosophy. When they finally reached a town large enough to have a newspaper, Elisabeth told their story to anyone who would listen. Most dismissed her as delusional, but a few believed, and those few began investigating. What they found at the burned ruins of Thornhill Manor confirmed every word. The circular chambers, the restraint systems, the cages, and eventually the graves. 48 numbered stones that became 48. Named daughters, once families were contacted, and girls identified, the scandal destroyed. The Society of the Eastern Gate. Dr. Thaddeus and Madam Mordaunt were found dead in the manor ruins, apparently unable or unwilling to escape the flames. Other society members were arrested, tried, convicted of crimes ranging from kidnapping to murder. The compact that had sustained a century of horror ended not with ritual or ceremony, but with prison sentences and public disgrace. Elisabeth's brothers were found and reunited with her, their father having drunk himself to death shortly after her collection. The 23 broken girls recovered slowly, some more than others, all bearing scars, but at least bearing them in freedom. The 7 unconscious girls woke and learned they'd been saved hours before transformation, and they went home to families who'd thought them lost forever. Elisabeth herself never fully returned to normal. The flower's gift had changed her permanently, giving her perception that allowed her to see parasitic influences wherever they appeared. Making her sensitive to exploitation dressed as tradition, she spent the rest of her life, and it was a long life, as the flower seemed to have granted her unusual vitality, exposing similar systems wherever she found them, working to end practices that fed on the vulnerable while claiming higher purposes. Catherine stayed with her, a partnership of survivors dedicated to ensuring no more daughters would be forgotten, no more families would trade children for false promises. And late at night, when Elisabeth couldn't sleep, she thought of Granny Ashwood, who'd somehow known exactly what the black flower would do, who'd given her the one weapon that could shatter the society's carefully constructed lies. She wondered how many other girls the old woman had helped over the years, how many other forgotten daughters had carried black flowers into darkness and emerged changed but unbroken. The story of Thornhill Manor became legend, a cautionary tale about the horrors that flourish when people choose comfort over conscience, when communities accept exploitation as long as it happens to someone else's children. Elisabeth made sure it was never forgotten, never softened, never transformed into the kind of myth that makes evil seem distant or inevitable. The Society of the Eastern Gate had been destroyed, but the impulses that created it, the willingness to sacrifice the vulnerable, the tendency to dress cruelty in philosophical clothing, the capacity to convince yourself that your victims deserve their fate, those impulses remained, waiting for new opportunities. So Elisabeth remained vigilant, and she taught others to be vigilant. And the Forgotten Daughters of Appalachia became a rallying cry for anyone who believed that no tradition justified harm, that no compact excused cruelty, that no child should ever be sold regardless of the promises made or the prices paid. She died at 93, surrounded by the children and grandchildren of girls she'd saved, having lived to see laws passed protecting children from exactly the kind of arrangements her father had made. Her last words, spoken to Catherine, who'd stayed with her until the end, were simple. We remembered them. That's what matters most. We remembered their names. And in the mountains of Appalachia, in the settlements of Virginia, in communities across the growing nation, people did remember. They remembered Elisabeth Hartley, who'd been sold at 12 and had somehow survived to expose the nightmare. They remembered Hannah Creek and Mary Sutton and all the other girls who'd vanished into Thornhill Manor. They remembered that evil often wears respectable faces and speaks in learned words, and that the only defense against it is to refuse to look away, refuse to forget, and refuse to accept that anyone's suffering is an acceptable price for anyone else's comfort. The black flower that had saved Elisabeth was never found. Some said it had dissolved completely in her body, others that she'd hidden it somewhere for another girl who might need its protection. But its legacy lived on in the survivors, in the laws, in the changed world where what had happened at Thornhill Manor could never happen again, at least not in quite the same way, and sometimes, in the deep hollows of Appalachia where fog clings to mountains like memories, people still whisper about the forgotten daughters who refused to be forgotten, about the girl who swallowed darkness and emerged as light, about the price of prosperity built on children's bones. They tell the story as warning and inspiration both, a reminder that evil is real but defeatable, that horror exists but can be survived, that the darkest nights eventually give way to dawn if you can just hold on long enough to see it. Elisabeth Hartley held on, and in holding on, she made sure that every daughter who came after her would have a chance to do the same.